Be they stalwart protectors clad in plate, powerful druids shapeshifted into towering bears, elusive monks, or mighty demon hunters, the tank is the character that protects their friends. But how do you tank? Well, let me show you. Hello there and welcome to the Tanking Guide. Over this series of videos we'll discuss everything you need to know to become a master tank. In our last lesson we learned about pacing and communication, and how improper pacing or lackluster communication can kill groups. In this lesson we'll be discussing how to deal with difficult players and situations. They're the bane of just about every group or raid. That one player who thinks they can pull enemies by themselves and relies upon you to save them, or who runs off in one direction while the rest of the group heads in another, or who even starts mouthing off, insulting other members of the party, including you. Dealing with players who are behaving like this can be very challenging, especially for newcomer tanks who are still settling into the role. I've heard lots of stories about players who've shied away from tanking after a few bad experiences with difficult players. So, how can you handle difficult players? Well, unfortunately there isn't an overarching rule or piece of advice that I can give you that will help you in every situation you'll come across, because the fact of the matter is that you'll be working and dealing with people, and people are vastly different to one another. The majority will likely be quiet and content, just doing their own thing, running the dungeon in complete silence. But there are always players who think they are better than everyone else, or who are inflammatory, or any other combination of words that will describe someone basically being a git. If you find yourself in a situation with a difficult player, the first thing that I can suggest is to never lower yourself to their level. Don't fight fire with fire and throw whatever they're doing back in their face, even if it seems logical to do so. It's very likely that an inflammatory player will, for instance, criticize the skill of party members while simultaneously making mistakes, and though pointing out those mistakes is very tempting, it won't help the situation at all. The second thing that I suggest is to keep yourself calm. This is doubly important if you're the one being targeted. Take a moment to calm yourself by leaning back and taking a deep breath. Do your best to never snap at someone or raise your voice. And yes, caps lock counts as raising your voice. It's important to remember that if you're getting criticized, the person criticizing you may actually genuinely just want to help, but they may be framing it in a way that you feel is nasty. So remember, keep calm. My third recommendation is to remember that this is a video game. You're playing it to have fun, hopefully, and the things that happen within it aren't that big of a deal in the grand scheme of things. Remember that we are one very small species on a very small planet, in a very small galaxy, in a very small solar system, in a very small universe, and I'm sure I screwed that up somewhere. You get the point. If you make a mistake and someone calls it out on you, don't be afraid to admit it, but don't go bonkers about it, because it's not a big deal. Everyone makes mistakes, and everyone learns one way or another. The next thing that I can suggest is to be communicative. If someone is being critical of you or the group, don't be afraid to lend a comment if it will help. And that's the important part of that sentence, if it will help. If you have nothing to say, then don't say anything. Most people, as I said, are content to just play the game in silence. But if you're being criticized, don't be afraid to mention the reasons for any mistakes you've made. There's no need to be defensive, because if a nasty player is genuinely trying to hurt you, there's very little they can do if you own up to a mistake and mention that you'll do your best to avoid it happening again. If you're defensive, if you try and argue with others, you'll just be giving ammunition to a player that doesn't have the group's best interests in mind. Okay, so let's discuss when the group is fragmented, i.e. when they have different ideas for dealing with a situation. Let's say you're running a dungeon, and you reach a fork. Your healer and one damage dealer runs left, and the other two damage dealers run right. What on earth do you do? Well, it's important to remember that as the tank, you are in control of the pacing of the dungeon, and most fights can't begin without you, so picking a direction will likely alter what the rest of the group does. That said, if you can, do your best to keep your healer close, because together you're the core of the group, and the damage dealers need both of you to succeed. Now I'd like to introduce a concept that I've learned through playing games like Heroes of the Storm. The idea of making a bad decision as opposed to not making a decision at all. I feel like it's applicable here. If someone in your party has a bad idea, and you find the group fragmented on it, make sure that whatever decision is made, you support it, even if that decision is made for you. For instance, let's say your group wants to do an escort quest or pull multiple packs of trash without you. It might be a bad decision, yes, but if you don't work with them and go ahead with the bad decision, then they are doomed to fail. If they pull groups of trash and you don't drop what you're doing to help them, they're doomed. But if you do work with them, and you do your best to make the bad decision work, then there's a much higher chance that the group will succeed. An entire team working with a bad decision is better than half a team working on a bad decision, and the other half of the team making no decision whatsoever. This applies to just about anything. If your group wants to pull multiple packs for you, do your best to tank them and use your cooldowns to help make the bad decision work. If they start working on an achievement mid-fight and it puts them in danger, do your best to compensate. Never just let members of your party die because they made a bad decision. It's your job to protect them, remember. If these bad decisions don't work out, then feel free to mention that. Kindly ask your group mates to let you pull and give them a reason for it. Mention that you're a newer tank or that your gear isn't quite up to par for what you're running. Give them a reason. Don't just demand that they do things your way, because remember, unless you are paying for their subscription fee, you can't tell them what to do in World of Warcraft. They might have an incentive to do things your way, i.e. it will work and they will get the loot and the experience and the rewards that they want, but they have no obligation to do what you say. That being said, it's also important to remember to communicate. If someone wants to do something you don't like the sound of, say no. Be polite about it, of course, don't just say no, but don't be afraid to tell folks that you're not confident about doing something, or that you're not in the mood to run a version of a dungeon that's much harder or longer. Begin the communication process, never just sit there in silence while people make decisions for you. And of course, if they make a decision and you agree with it, let them know. Again, don't just sit there in silence. Now, what about difficult situations that are caused by other people not performing up to scratch? What if the healer can't keep up with the damage that you're taking? What if the damage dealers can't kill the boss before the healer runs out of mana? What do you do in these kind of situations where other players are underperforming? Well, again, the first thing to do is to communicate. Don't just bash your head against the wall over and over in silence. Offer advice, but don't be critical. There's no reason to. Yes, if players are underperforming, they're underperforming, but if you just say, hey, you're not doing enough damage, what does that offer them? It offers them about as much good information as if they said to you, hey, you're not tanking properly. It doesn't tell you anything, so offer advice. If an ad isn't dying fast enough, feel free to mention that to the damage dealers. Just say, hey, this ad is probably not dying quickly enough. We need to make sure that we switch to it. Make sure you say we, not you, because it's your responsibility to help with this kind of thing. And again, lumping the blame on everyone is much better than lumping the blame on one person, so say we. If the healer is struggling to keep you alive, think about what you can do to help mitigate damage, be it from using your cooldowns at different times, fighting fewer enemies if possible, or even kiting them to help you survive. Don't just let the healer suffer in silence. And remember, keep an eye on their mana so you don't start a difficult fight with them at anything less than full. Other potential problems can stem from similar issues. Some players can be impatient, demanding that you pull more enemies faster, or even doing it for you. Again, remember that a bad decision with everyone's support is better than no decision. So, if you and your healer can manage it, feel free to speed up when dealing with impatient players. But if you're not confident, feel free to state this. If players ignore your concerns and impatiently pull extra enemies, do your best to keep up. But if it kills you, then point this out. Kindly ask them to let you pull so that you aren't killed again. If they continue to make your life difficult, if they refuse to offer you any kind of respite, if they are continuing to be critical and toxic, then you have two options. Leave the dungeon, or try and kick them. Generally, trying to kick a player for just being toxic is not a grand idea unless they are being toxic to every single player in the group, because then everyone has a reason to want them out of the group. But if they're just being critical of you, and you want to kick them for it, the rest of the group will likely not agree, and then the integrity of the whole dungeon is put at risk. So generally, I would suggest if you have to pick between these two, leave the dungeon and find another. You are a tank, remember, queues are pretty fast, so you're not losing nearly as much time as a damage dealer would be. And you have absolutely no obligation to put up with toxic players that aren't willing to help the group succeed. Finally, a note on knowledge. There's a general kind of stereotype that the tank is supposed to know everything about a dungeon, and a lot of players will either rely on you to know what to do, or they'll not offer help if you ask. Although this isn't always the case, and any player can make a group's life easier by offering advice, my suggestion here is to learn all you can about dungeons and raids before you enter them. Googling them is often the best idea, but my suggestions for specific sites are Wowhead, Icy Veins, the Fat Boss TV YouTube channel for raid guides, and Wowpedia for general information. Often typing in something like Wowhead Grimrail Depot Guide will give you the first result with all the information you need. You can also use the dungeon journal. It's there, all you need to do is open your map and click on a boss, and bam, you have the information. Which is honestly what World of Warcraft's all about. Information, knowledge, and then execution. Knowing, as they say, is half the battle. That will conclude this lesson about difficult players and situations. It can be extremely challenging to deal with these nasty situations, and most players prefer to just ignore them, but I would feel bad about not mentioning some of these situations that you can find yourself in. Of course, there are far too many specific situations and players for me to list, but remember that you're playing a game for fun, and that you're dealing with other people that deserve your kindness and respect, even if they don't judge you worthy of having theirs. In our next lesson, we'll discuss different types of players, and how to work with various healers and damage dealers. This won't be the same as communicating with players and helping them succeed, but instead we'll focus on how you should change your playstyle when working with certain kinds of players. When do you pull faster, or slower, or in a certain way, and at what point should you start discussing this with the people you're playing with? Empathy here is the key. Thank you very much for watching. If you have any questions, thoughts, comments, or suggestions, you can contact me using the links in the description, or you can just leave a comment. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I wish you the best of luck in the World of Warcraft.